The first thing the forest did was take your eyes. Not permanently, not at once, but the moment a soldier of the 9th Infantry Division stepped past the tree line in September 1944, the world he had operated in, the open world of roads and fields and visible horizons, ceased to exist.
The fir trees of the Hürtgen pressed together at a density that military historians would later describe as among the most tactically hostile terrain encountered by the United States Army in the entire European campaign. Not because of enemy fortifications, though those existed. Not because of minefield density, though that was severe.
But because the forest itself constituted an environment that violated every assumption about combat that American soldiers had been trained to hold. The canopy overhead was not a roof. A roof has gaps, lets light pass at angles, admits some awareness of sky and weather and direction.
The Hürtgen's canopy was a seal, interleaved branches of spruce and fir, 40 and 50 feet above the forest floor, shut out the November sky with the completeness of a ceiling. At midday, the light inside the forest reached the equivalent of early dusk.
By mid-afternoon, movement between positions required physical contact with trees to navigate. By late afternoon, it was simply dark. Not night dark with stars above, but a closed, textureless dark that pressed against open eyes without providing information. Men who fought there would later describe, in after-action reports and memoirs collected by the U.S. Army Center of Military History, a specific and consistent phenomenon, the sense that the forest was not a place they moved through, but a place that held them. It did not feel like terrain. It felt like confinement, but the darkness was not what killed them first.
The Germans had been preparing the Hürtgen Forest as a defensive position since the summer of 1944, and their preparations were built around a single tactical insight that American commanders would spend months learning at tremendous cost.
In open terrain, artillery shells detonate on impact with the ground, and the lethal fragmentation pattern spreads outward in a radius at roughly ground level, which means soldiers in foxholes, trenches, or any form of ground depression receive substantial protection from shrapnel. The physics of ground burst detonation makes depth the primary survival variable. Every soldier learns this. Every soldier digs.
In the Hürtgen, depth provided almost no protection at all. German artillery shells, 105mm and 150mm howitzer rounds, fired from positions on the eastern ridges, were calibrated to impact not the ground, but the trees.
When a high-explosive artillery shell detonates inside a mature spruce tree at 30 or 40 feet, the physics change completely. The steel casing fragments in all directions, as always, but simultaneously, the tree itself explodes. Wood that has grown under compression for decades releases that energy instantaneously. Splinters the size of a man's forearm, some longer, some dense enough to carry the momentum of a bullet, drive downward and outward from the detonation point. They do not scatter the way shrapnel scatters. They drive. Let me show you what that means for a man in a foxhole. He has done what every trained soldier does. He has found or dug a position in the earth. He has his helmet on. He is below ground level. And in any other environment, on any other front, his survivability in a near-miss artillery strike is statistically reasonable. In the Hürtgen, that same near-miss detonates 40 feet above his position, and the wooden fragments drive downward at a steep angle into a foxhole that provides no overhead cover. The steel helmet, the M1, which was designed to deflect shrapnel approaching from lateral and low angles, was not engineered to stop a wood splinter the size of a forearm driving downward at high velocity. After-action reports from the 28th Infantry Division, which suffered some of the worst casualties in the entire Hürtgen campaign, document soldiers killed in foxholes by wood fragmentation without a single piece of steel shrapnel in the wound. The tree was the weapon. The shell was merely the detonation mechanism. This is why veterans of the Hürtgen would tell interviewers decades later that the sound of incoming artillery in the forest was different from anywhere else they had ever fought. In open terrain, the instinct on hearing incoming rounds is to go down, go flat, get below the surface of the earth. In the Hürtgen, that instinct would get you killed.
The correct response to incoming artillery in the Hürtgen was to press yourself against the trunk of the nearest large tree and pray the round did not hit it, because the trunk would absorb and redirect the downward fragmentation pattern.
This was not something that appeared in any training manual. It was something survivors taught replacements during the first hours of their arrival, in the compressed, quiet voice of men conveying information they expected might save a life today and be irrelevant tomorrow.
But the wood fragmentation was only one dimension of the forest hostility. The ground itself was a second weapon. The Hürtgen sits in a region of the German-Belgian border where the geology produces a specific soil composition, clay-dense, with poor drainage, resting at elevations between 1,200 and 2,400 feet. The forest canopy prevents evaporation. The November rains of 1944 were above the seasonal average. The combination produced conditions that military engineers documented in surveying reports as soil saturation approaching maximum field capacity, a technical phrase that means, in practical terms, the ground could not absorb another drop of water.
Every footstep compressed standing moisture upward around the boot. Every foxhole filled within hours of being dug. Every position that men occupied for more than a day became a water trap. American combat boots in 1944 were leather, high-quality, well-constructed leather that performed adequately in dry conditions and moderate wetness.
In the Hürtgen, leather became a liability. Once saturated, leather does not dry in field conditions. It remains wet indefinitely. And wet leather, pressed against human feet for 48 continuous hours, begins a process that military medicine would classify under the term trench foot, a condition named from the previous war, rediscovered in this one, and documented in the Hürtgen at rates that alarmed both divisional medical officers and the Army Surgeon General's office. Here is what trench foot does, because the name makes it sound minor, and it is not minor. The process begins with constant moisture against the skin, inhibiting the normal evaporation that regulates foot temperature. The feet become chronically cold, not frostbitten, not below freezing, but persistently held at temperatures just above where tissue begins to die. In this range, the small blood vessels in the feet progressively constrict as the body tries to conserve core temperature. Blood flow to the toes, the ball of the foot, and the heel reduces. The nerves in the foot first become hypersensitive. The pain of walking becomes significant, then severe. Then, as constriction progresses, the nerves go numb. The foot stops hurting because it no longer receives adequate signals from its own tissue. When soldiers in the Hürtgen removed their boots after 72 hours, when they were finally rotated off the line or extracted by medical personnel, the documented findings in field medical records from the 4th Infantry Division include feet that had turned gray-blue, feet where the skin separated from the underlying tissue when touched, feet where the superficial tissue was visibly dying while the deeper structures remained alive.
Men who could not feel their feet had been walking on them for days without knowing the degree of damage accumulating with each step. The 4th Infantry Division evacuated 4,053 men for non-battle medical causes during its time in the Hürtgen.
Trench foot accounted for a significant proportion. These were not men who left the line because they chose to. These were men whose feet had failed to the point where walking was no longer possible. But the cold and the wet were things the men could name. Things with clinical designations, things that existed in some training material somewhere, even if the training had been inadequate. The darkness was different. There is a specific quality of sustained low-light exposure in enclosed environments that military psychology has documented across multiple campaigns: the Hürtgen, the Pacific jungle fighting, portions of the Italian mountain campaign, that does not reduce cleanly to any single clinical category. It is not blindness. It is not depression. It is something more fundamental, the disruption of the cognitive orientation that comes from being able to see far enough to know where you are. Human spatial cognition is calibrated for an environment that extends visually to a horizon. The ability to look outward, even briefly, even at a distance, provides constant low-level orientation data, direction, relative position, the relationship between your current location and the broader world. In the Hürtgen, that data was simply absent. The farthest any soldier could see in most sections of the forest was 40 to 60 feet before the trees occluded everything.
In low light, that distance compressed further.
Direction became a matter of compass only, a tool that required stopping, orienting, and checking, rather than the instinctive spatial awareness that comes from being able to see a hill, a road, a farmhouse, or anything that existed at a distance.
Soldiers in the Hürtgen reported, in unit diaries and debriefings collected after the campaign, a progressive erosion of what one after-action report from the 9th Infantry Division described as positional confidence, the certainty that you know where you are.
After 2 days inside the forest canopy without sight of the sky, the orientation that most people never notice because it is always there began to dissolve. Men moved in formations and lost track of whether they were advancing or retreating.
Patrols sent to establish contact with adjacent units sometimes walked in circles, returning to their own starting positions from the wrong direction. Units dug positions they were convinced were facing east and discovered at dawn that they were facing north.
This was not incompetence. This was the forest doing to spatial cognition what sustained cold was doing to the feet, depriving them of the input they required to function normally.
And meanwhile, the forest was turning sound into a weapon as well. Let me show you the acoustic environment of the Hürtgen. In open terrain, sound travels outward from its source in patterns that experienced soldiers learn to interpret spatially. A rifle shot has a directional signature. An artillery piece fires with a thump that can be roughly triangulated. Armored vehicles produce a particular combination of engine and track noise that indicates both the type and approximate distance. In the Hürtgen's dense canopy, sound did not travel outward, it bounced. The tree density reflected sound at angles that dissociated it from its source. An MG-42 machine gun firing from a position 70 meters east would sound to the men in its target zone as though it was firing from multiple directions simultaneously. Artillery detonations in the canopy above produced a concussive wave that had no clear point of origin. It arrived from everywhere at once.
The men learned a specific listening adaptation. Because the forest turned directional sound into ambient sound, experienced soldiers in the Hürtgen developed the practice of holding completely still when a firefight initiated, not to avoid movement, but to listen past the immediate sound and find the specific acoustic signature that revealed actual direction.
This required suppressing the instinctive flinch, the urge to move, the survival response that said, "Get down, get cover, get away." It required holding still in the open, in the dark, while things that killed were making noise from no identifiable direction, and listening with a degree of deliberate calm that men who had not been in the Hürtgen for weeks simply could not achieve. Replacements who arrived directly from training, without the weeks of acclimation that survivors had developed, were statistically much more likely to die in their first 72 hours, not because they were less skilled, because they had not yet learned to hear. But the most devastating thing the Hürtgen Forest produced was not any specific physical damage. It was the routine.
By October 1944, units that had been in the forest for 3 weeks had developed what officers in their after-action reports described as a normalized attrition rate, an expected daily loss that had been factored into operational planning, the way weather was factored in.
The 9th Infantry Division, which entered the Hürtgen in September and fought into November, documented average daily losses that included killed, wounded, and evacuated for medical causes. These were not peak combat losses. These were the baseline, the rate at which the forest consumed soldiers on days when nothing significant happened.
The morning report, the daily document each company submitted, recording strength and casualties, became a kind of daily accounting of how much of the unit remained. Soldiers who had been in the forest long enough had seen enough morning reports to understand the mathematics intuitively. If a company entered the Hürtgen at full strength, roughly 193 men, and sustained average losses for that forest, the mathematics indicated that in 3 weeks, approximately what was left would not constitute a functional combat unit.
Men who understood these numbers continued their duties, not through heroism specifically, not through the kind of willful courage that makes good stories, through something quieter and more disturbing, the exhaustion of any alternative. The forest was what existed. The mission was what it was. The morning report would reflect what it would reflect.
Some of them had stopped calculating their own odds because the calculation produced a number they had decided not to look at.
The position at the breakfast fire, if there was a fire, and frequently there was not, because fires produced smoke the Germans could see, and they had already demonstrated they knew where the foxholes were. The position at that fire where someone had sat yesterday and was not sitting today was simply not mentioned.
This was not suppression of grief. Grief requires energy that the forest had spent on keeping men alive. The empty position at the breakfast fire was information. One fewer mouth, one fewer rifle, one more name for the morning report.
The men who remained nodded at it and ate. Now let me show you what the forest did to the mind. By the third week of sustained exposure, confirmed across multiple unit histories, multiple divisions, multiple sections of the forest, the psychiatric casualty rate in the Hürtgen began to approach the physical casualty rate.
The Army used the term combat exhaustion rather than the previous war's shell shock, and the clinical presentation in the Hürtgen had specific features distinct from combat exhaustion in other theaters. The most common feature was not dramatic breakdown.
It was the gradual loss of the ability to process information at the speed survival required.
Officers who had commanded their units in Normandy and through the breakout in August, men with demonstrated competence under sustained combat stress, were documenting in their own after-action reports an increasing difficulty in holding operational information in working memory. Simple tactical calculations that should have taken seconds were taking minutes. The fog that soldiers have described across centuries of warfare was present in the Hürtgen in a particularly dense form, and the best explanation that Army psychiatrists could construct at the time was that the combination of chronic sleep deprivation, chronic cold stress, sustained acoustic assault, and the specific visual disorientation produced by the forest canopy was overloading the brain's ability to maintain executive function. A man can compensate for sleep deprivation alone. He can compensate for cold alone.
He can compensate for sustained noise alone. He can compensate for spatial disorientation alone. The Hürtgen administered all four simultaneously, at high intensity, without interruption, for days and then weeks at a time. The compensatory capacity of the human brain under that combination of stressors did not last 3 weeks.
The 1st Infantry Division's regimental surgeon documented in late November 1944 that he was evaluating men for psychiatric evacuation who, when asked basic orientation questions, their unit, their rank, their current mission, could answer correctly, but required long pauses between responses that the surgeon described as not confusion, but exhaustion of processing. The men knew the answers.
Their brains were too depleted to retrieve and deliver them at normal speed. These men were not cowards. The forest had simply run them down to the substrate. But you have to understand the scale of what the forest held. By the time the Hürtgen campaign ended in February 1945, the United States Army had committed the equivalent of 19 divisions to those 50 square miles of German forest. The total American strength rotated through the Hürtgen over the 5-month campaign exceeded 120,000 men.
Of those, official casualty figures, killed, wounded, captured, non-battle medical evacuations, totaled approximately 33,000. Other estimates, accounting for men evacuated through unofficial channels or classified under administrative categories that obscured combat-related damage, pushed the figure higher.
Put that in physical terms, because numbers require scale. The Hürtgen Forest, the specific terrain over which this fighting occurred, is roughly 50 square miles. The National Mall in Washington, D.C. is approximately 1 square mile.
The entire Hürtgen was 50 National Mall lengths.
In that space, over 5 months, the United States Army absorbed casualties at a rate that exceeded some of the most intense fighting of the entire European campaign. Fighting that had none of the dramatic clarity of D-Day, none of the clean narrative of the Bulge, and produced none of the visible strategic objectives that made loss legible as sacrifice. The forest consumed those men and did not change shape. And then there is the cow trail.
The Call Trail is a logging road, barely that really, more accurately a track, that descends into the Call River Valley in the center of the Hürtgen Forest. In November 1944, the 28th Infantry Division's 112th Infantry Regiment attempted to use the call trail to advance through the forest and take the village of Schmidt, a modest objective on the far side of the valley.
The trail was the only route that could accommodate resupply vehicles. Without resupply on the trail, any force that reached Schmidt could not be sustained.
What happened on the call trail between November 2 and 8, 1944, was documented in a post-war Army report that described it as one of the most complete tactical failures in the American Army's experience in the European theater.
The 112th Infantry reached Schmidt with 2 battalions.
But the trail behind them became impassable. German artillery cut off resupply, German infantry cut the trail itself, and the 2 battalions in Schmidt, isolated on the far side of a river valley in a forest that was actively trying to kill them, were left without ammunition, medical support, food, or a viable route of withdrawal. What came back down the call trail over the following days was not an organized withdrawal.
It was, in the words of the Army's own subsequent investigation, a rout. Men who had exhausted their ammunition, who had fought for 6 days without resupply in the worst conditions the European campaign produced, who had watched their companies reduce from 190 men to below 40, came back down that trail in groups and individually, some without weapons, some without helmets, some in states that the Army classified under available psychiatric categories, and some in states that resisted classification entirely. The 112th Infantry Regiment's 3 battalions entered the Schmidt operation with a combined strength of approximately 2,978 men.
In 8 days, they suffered 2,093 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, and psychiatrically evacuated. What remained of the regiment at the end of those 8 days did not constitute a functional combat organization. The Germans held Schmidt for another 3 months.
Here is the thing about the Hürtgen that the statistics cannot fully convey. Survival in that forest was not a function of skill, preparation, or courage in any degree that those who survived could reliably identify. The mathematics of random fragmentation from above, from a tree that a shell happened to hit 40 feet overhead, did not consult a man's training record before driving a wooden splinter through the neck of the soldier to his left and leaving him intact.
The artillery round that exploded in the canopy above the position of the company's most experienced sergeant did not register that the company needed him more than the replacement who had been there 6 days and happened to be standing 12 feet to the right.
Survivors of the Hürtgen, interviewed by historians over the decades after the war, describe with unusual consistency a particular moment, not during the fighting itself, but at some point after it had ended, when they confronted the arithmetic of their own survival.
Most of them had specific knowledge of men who were more skilled, more experienced, more careful, and more physically capable, but who had not come out. Some of them had specific knowledge of men who had survived by pure accident, by being assigned to a different position the night before, by stopping to adjust a bootlace, by falling behind a patrol that walked into an ambush. The honest ones will tell you they cannot construct a coherent explanation for why they lived.
The best they can say is that the forest didn't hit them, not that they evaded the forest, that the forest, on the specific days when it could have killed them, happened not to. This distinction matters more than it might seem.
Because the competence that American soldiers brought to the Hürtgen, and they brought real competence, real training, real courage, operated within a range of outcomes that the forest's random lethality could override at any moment. Competence reduced some risks. It taught a man to press against a tree trunk when incoming rounds approached. It taught him to listen before he moved. It helped him survive the forest's predictable hazards at a rate slightly better than ignorance would allow. But it could not address the round that hit the tree 40 feet above, a position that no human decision had made more or less likely to receive that specific impact.
The survivors carried this knowledge out of the forest, and carrying it changed them. But before we get to what they carried out, you have to understand what the forest did to the line between soldier and civilian, which is another way of saying what it did to moral identity.
In normal combat conditions, if normal is a word that has any legitimate use in this conversation, there are defined categories of threat and defined responses. The enemy is in front. You advance, hold, or withdraw.
The boundary between action and inaction has moral clarity.
You are doing what soldiers do, against the people soldiers fight, in ways that training has defined as legitimate. In the Hürtgen, those categories dissolved.
When the forest is the weapon, and the forest is everywhere, the combat instinct, the primal activation that training channels into directed action, has no coherent direction to focus. The enemy was in prepared positions throughout the forest, but between those positions, the forest itself was lethal.
Men were not dying only when they encountered Germans. They were dying in the spaces between encounters, from the trees, from the cold, from the ground under their feet. The threat was ambient. It was in every direction simultaneously.
Under these conditions, something began to happen to the moral architecture of tactical decision-making that Army after-action reports document with careful professional restraint, and that veterans discuss with less restraint in oral histories collected decades later.
When a unit was ordered to advance through forest terrain that every available piece of intelligence indicated was saturated with German positions, and that intelligence was correct, and the unit knew it was correct, and the officers who gave the order also knew it was correct, the men who executed that order did not do so because they believed it was likely to succeed.
They did so because the institutional structure required it, because the alternative was court-martial, because refusing orders, even orders that were functionally death sentences, was not something that could be done without consequences that extended beyond the forest. This is a different kind of moral erosion than battlefield atrocity. It is quieter, more diffuse, and in some ways more psychologically devastating, because it has no perpetrator and no victim in the conventional sense.
It is the erosion that comes from being required to send men you know will probably die into a position you know will probably kill them, not because the strategic logic demands it, but because the operational inertia demands it.
Several regimental and battalion commanders in the Hürtgen filed after-action reports that are, in the language of military bureaucracy, extraordinary documents, reports that describe in professionally measured terms the impossibility of executing the missions they had been assigned with the forces available, the terrain existing, and the casualty rates that prior operations had established.
These reports were filed. They were read. The operations continued.
The men who led those operations, the company commanders, the platoon leaders, the sergeants who organized the movement and stepped off first, came out of the forest knowing something about the institution they served and about themselves that had not been available to them when they entered.
They had done what was required. They had done it knowing the cost before the cost was paid.
And they had come home carrying that knowledge, which does not have a clean clinical category the way trenchfoot does, but which persists in exactly the same way, as damage that the end of the conditions does not reverse. Most of them never talked about the Hürtgen at all.
This is the thing that veterans of the Hürtgen share most consistently with historians who have sought them out. Not the combat itself, not the specific days, not even the specific losses, though those are there specifically when they do speak, but the subsequent discovery that the forest had no adequate language. The broader culture that received them home in 1945 had Normandy. It had the Bulge. It had a coherent narrative of the European war that assigned meaning to sacrifice through dramatic visibility. The Hürtgen had produced no dramatic victories, no iconic photographs, no named operations that entered the common vocabulary of the war's remembered story.
What the Hürtgen had produced was 33,000 casualties and a piece of German forest that looked exactly the same when American soldiers finally cleared it in February 1945, as it had when the first patrol entered it in September 1944. The Germans had needed it to protect the Rohr River dams. Those dams held throughout the campaign. The strategic objective that had motivated the entire operation, controlling the water flow that could flood the Rohr Valley and halt any Allied advance, was not secured by the forest fighting. It was eventually secured by other means. The men who had been consumed in acquiring the forest received in exchange for what the forest cost them, a forest.
The physical Hürtgen, the trees, the clay ground, the call trail, the ridgelines, still exist. It is a working forest today, managed for timber production. Hikers walk the trails. The trees are mature, the kind of trees that grow back in 80 years from stumps.
A person walking there today would find, if they looked carefully, occasional remnants,
corroded metal objects, depressions in the ground that were once fighting positions, and in certain areas, signs indicating that unexploded ordnance may still exist in the soil.
The ordnance does not decay on the same timeline as memory. The men who survived the Hürtgen went home to lives that were, by the external metrics available in 1945, ordinary. They married, they worked, they raised children.
Several of them became prominent in civilian life. Ernest Hemingway covered the Hürtgen as a correspondent and wrote almost nothing about it afterward, a fact that literary scholars have noted and which the veterans who knew him would not have found surprising.
J.D. Salinger fought in the Hürtgen and entered the forest's aftermath carrying everything he would spend the rest of his life trying to write around without writing about. What the forest had done to them persisted in specific, documentable ways.
Veterans Administration records from the post-war period show elevated rates of what was then classified as anxiety neurosis, later reclassified, as the diagnostic vocabulary developed, under categories that recognized sustained combat exposure as a precipitating cause rather than a character deficiency.
Sleep disturbances were documented in medical records extending into the 1950s and 1960s. Hypervigilance patterns, the constant background scanning for ambient threat, the difficulty of being in enclosed spaces with poor visibility, the involuntary response to sudden sounds, were noticed by spouses and children without necessarily understanding their origin.
The cold the men of the Hürtgen still felt 20 years later was not meteorological. It was the specific 3-degree damp clay cold of November 1944, which had been encoded not as a memory, but as a physical reference point that the body returned to under conditions the thinking mind would not have associated with the forest at all. A chill in a parking garage, a sound in a basement.
The forest had internalized. It now existed inside the men who had survived it, triggered by sensory inputs that bore structural similarity to its original conditions. The trees themselves were gone, the positions overgrown, the German units disbanded, the war concluded, the strategic objectives analyzed and cataloged in official histories.
None of that mattered to the part of the mind that had been reconfigured by 19 weeks of ambient lethality in 50 square miles of German fir trees. The forest did not end when they left it. It traveled with them.
And this is the thing that is most important to understand about the Hürtgen, and about what environments like it do, that combat itself does not always do. The most profound damage was not inflicted by the Germans.
The German soldiers who held those positions were professional, effective, and deeply competent at extracting maximum lethal efficiency from the terrain available to them. They deserve that acknowledgement. But the German soldiers did not create the darkness under the canopy, or the clay soil, or the November rain, or the acoustic chaos of sound deflected by dense timber. They merely understood how to use what the forest already was.
What the forest already was, that cold, sealed, directionless, acoustically confused, randomly lethal environment, is what broke the men who entered it. Not their courage, not their training, not their will. The environment dissolved those things the way the wet dissolved the leather of their boots. Slowly, continuously, without negotiation. 33,000 Americans in 50 square miles over 19 weeks. None of the trees noticed. Here's my question for you.
The Hürtgen Forest is one of the least discussed major American battles of World War II, and after everything this video has laid out, I want to ask you, does the absence of a clear victory narrative affect how we as a culture are willing to remember suffering?
The men in the Hürtgen endured something as extreme as anything the war produced. Their losses were real, the damage was permanent. But because there was no decisive breakthrough, no famous photograph, no iconic moment, the forest has been largely forgotten by popular memory.
Does survival need a victory attached to it in order to be remembered? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this changed how you think about what the environment itself can do to human beings, hit that like button and subscribe for more history that goes into the places official narratives tend to leave behind.
Thanks for watching.